Welcome back to part 2 of plein air painting these gorgeous blooming trees in gouache. We're investigating what's the largest you can paint in gouache when a political protest marched through our painting scene.
This is amazing. The protest is going to march right by us, everybody.
If you haven't seen part 1 yet, click on the card to watch part 1 in another tab and then come back to this video to continue the story.
You know, it's very easy to feel that we live in contentious times and times of upheaval, and for me, art is kind of a break from all of that. It isn't necessarily today, but usually art serves as kind of my getaway from the news and current events and the contentiousness of life. One of the things that I often think about is if some of the painters from the Impressionist era and beyond, the painters that we admire, if they also had things like this, you know, contentious issues of their day interfere with their artwork or affect their artwork. And I think we know the answer to that is yes. Whether that's industrial revolution to wars and floods and calamities, this is kind of the beauty of realistic art, that we don't shy away from the reality of life. We embrace the realities of life, and we try to show what is actually happening. This is what Edward Manet did with a lot of his artwork and paintings, and why he was considered such a radical. And it's also what many other painters did as well. And so that's part of the artistic tradition, I think, is to describe what's happening and what's going on. But I also think that in many ways art can be our relief and our peace and our getaway from the things that are going on as well. I always tell people you can't get too much art. You know, you can get too much food, too much alcohol, too much work. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. But in general, you can't get too much beauty. You can't get too much art. Maybe there are certain ways to, you know, overwork yourself, or but in general, you'll never regret making beautiful things, taking time to observe beautiful things. So I'm mixing up kind of a dullish yellow here and just covering the ground plane, which is going to be the next lightest thing after the sky, because I want to start working into getting everything covered. And so we're kind of at a decent place here. I'm going to overlay over this dirty yellow. I'm going to overlay the darker greens, or just the lighter greens of the ground plane that's catching the sky. Okay, so we have a lot of our big shapes more or less blocked in, and so I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. This is a 3/4 of an inch brush, so just slightly smaller, but we're going to start working on with some smaller brushes, reinforcing the darks and refining our shapes. So I want to go in again. I'm going to get my darkest color that I can get here. Lots of ultramarine blue, some alizarin, and more ultramarine blue here. That alizarin is very powerful color, and a little bit of yellow ochre to mute it. But see, when I add that yellow ochre in, it becomes much lighter, so I have to reinforce. And you know, when you're mixing colors, it's kind of this push and pull between getting the tonal value and the actual chroma that you want. Just a little bit of yellow ochre to desaturate. So as I'm looking at this now, I'm going to kind of just reinforce the edge here and come in like this And the edge of these trees is getting a little bit more darkness. So I'm going to reinforce some of those and the branches that go up into the trees. And by doing this, we can kind of create more of that three-dimensionality. And this is what I meant by saying, like, we can repaint a lot of these things. And I see, like, the tree branches inside the tree are quite dark, and a lot of the tree branches that come up out of the tops also are quite dark. And these sort of everything that's a little bit onto the right side of these tree trunks, we're going to darken down a little bit. Even more blue. Love that church bell. That is shaping up. So a lot of times you get into that ugly phase, but you just gotta fight through it. Okay. What should we do next? Let's put in some of the darker greens. So I'm going to mix into that really dark that I had some of this yellow. And it's going to give me a muted yellow. It's going to raise the temperature a little bit, raise the value a little bit. And so we're going to play with that. Adding more blue, a little bit of red to desaturate and darken, a little bit of yellow, more blue. And it's just a back and forth with your color mixing. For me, I kind of am thinking, I'm thinking about my local color. Which obviously it's green, so that's going to be some combination of weighting it towards blue and yellow, but I'm also trying to think about tonal value. And I think I'm just slightly too dark, so I'm going to raise it a little bit. You can raise value with paint in two ways, by adding yellows or by adding whites. And right now I think I want to add more yellows. And how about just a touch of white? There we go. And let's see what that looks like. See, it still looks pretty dark, and that's what we're after. So I'm going to use the texture and the side of this brush to kind of stipple in. And you can see how we're able to, by kind of shoving the brush into there, I'm able to not just like fully cover that dark shadow color that we put in, but to also get some really interesting texture. This comes up a little bit. And so this is one of the beauties of gouache. I think you could maybe call this dry brushing to a certain extent. Not if I keep adding water like that, though. But if you utilize the brush in many different ways, you can, as the paint dries on the surface, Or you can dry off your brush like this so that it's not just so saturated. You can create these textures and get like the colors of your paint intermingling instead of thinking about painting every single brush stroke of for painting every single leaf with minute brush strokes. There's a place for that, but you can get a lot of work done by utilizing the brush just in a different way. So again, we've done all this work to kind of talk about where our darks are, where our shadows are, and so this is helping us. That we're gonna lay over the top of this now. I don't want such a regular shape, so I'm kind of breaking up the edge of this tree. It's not actually a ball, so we can break that up and get more of that sense of texture. Good. Looking good. Let's also put in, a lot of times underneath the trees, as we can see here, there's more kind of shrubberies and growth. And those are vertical too. I always like adding those in. That little. Usually the lawnmowers can't get everything underneath there. I like adding that in. Add just more texture and things. Reinforce some of these darks. And again, at this point, we're not necessarily looking for like perfectly smooth gradients, but more of that idea of like creating some texture. But as we get farther back, I'm not as interested in that texture, because remember what your focal point is. One more time, I want to go in. Now I'm going to go in with a number 6 brush, quite a small brush, and again reinforce my darks of some of the tree branches in this tree. Let's try just differentiating it. Not everything has to be the same. So I'm just going to keep it that blue and that alizarin. See if I can get something that's like a little bit different. Utilize color to your advantage. I love the juxtaposition of the fullness of these trees with the kind of the gnarled, angular, rough edges of these branches. And this time I added a little bit more yellow, and you can see that yellow next to this creates kind of a different type of a color there. And the more that you can just vary your colors and vary your tones, the more that you can create visual interest, layering things. So, looking into the tree, we're seeing some, now that we've kind of got our lighter or darker greens, now I look into it and I see much lighter greens, kind of sporadically placed, and then our highlights of our blooms. So, keeping my paint palette wet, let me continue to use this 3/4 of an inch brush, but now I'm going to make a new mixture: cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and it's quite saturated. I'm going to desaturate it with some red, add a little bit more blue to that, cool that down, and maybe some white for some opacity. This might be a little bit fluid, so if you get your paint too fluid, a lot of times the answer is to add more paint. If we kept it that fluid, it would be quite transparent. So now I am actually looking for some opacity, and the white will help with that. Okay, so let's drop some in here, and that's still kind of transparent. So adding some more white to that, and some more blue, so that I don't lose too much. I don't want to raise that tonal value too much, but it's not too bad. I still feel like it needs to be a little bit more opaque. So really, again, you could really say, like, what color are we looking at here? This is kind of a gray. And why is that? Well, because we've mixed in all of our primaries again. But it's just that really color mixing kind of comes down to weighting your mixtures of all your three colors towards the local color, or towards, like, when you think of, okay, I need a green here, or I need a blue here, or I need a, whatever your local color is. I think that needs a little bit more red into it. Feels too saturated. And maybe a little bit more blue. Actually, maybe a little bit more yellow, right? So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I don't want it to be too cool, especially because if we think about those blooms are going to be quite cool. So we'll warm it up with some yellow, some of our alizarin crimson. And really, a lot of the tree is on this left side has more of the green into it. And now I'm like starting to pay attention to the direction of the branches. And the more that you can like kind of layer things like this, where we see the shadows inside, and we have this coming up over the top of it and overlapping those shapes, the more that you're going to get that sense of depth. So I want to bring some down here like that. And there's not too much in this other tree, but we will put a little bit in there. But mostly this tree in the middle still has a lot of its, mostly just the blooms. Add a little bit of water to that and a lot more yellow now to differentiate the tones of the trees, because this tree behind it does have a lot of greenery And again, that was one of the juxtapositions we were looking for originally. This tree right here has a lot of red mixed in. So I'm going to add a little bit of that alizarin for kind of a really orangey green. The reason why it has that is because this tree actually has some red berries on it. And I'm going to keep this one kind of loose because it's not the focal point. We'll use a little bit of that yellow ochre and a little bit of blue. You know, I don't want to cover up all the shadow that we created. I want there to be like the intermingling of those shapes. There. I like that. Okay. Let's start mixing some varieties of pinks for these blooms. I'm going to put out a little bit more alizarin, just fresh out on the palette. Don't be afraid to do that. I'm going to do the same for some of my ultramarine. I've kind of been fighting the paint a little bit, so I think it'll be good to put some more out. So even though this is kind of a palette that's supposed to keep my paint wet, it does get dry eventually, and it's always good to bring some tubes of paint with you. Let's see what happens if we just use alizarin and white. Get a very nice bright color here. And I think I might have added too much white there, so let's kind of pop that back up with some more of that paint. Essentially when I'm looking at the blooms, I'm seeing some that are darker red or darker pink, and then I'm seeing some that are much lighter pink, like over here. So I want to create at least 2 different versions of this pink to get that. So let's use this as our darker. Just add a little bit more into that. Now I am using a smaller brush. I'm squinting down and dropping in kind of the approximation of what I see. And I'm thinking about the direction that these are going. You know, they're going up. These trees kind of have different tendrils and bows that are leaning over. I want to try to capture that direction. And even looking at some of the ones like down here that I had already put some of my green to suggest some of that direction. And then up in here, I'm going to dry the brush. I'm going to use the side of the brush to cover a lot of ground. Because there's a ton of them right up in here. But pulling that up into the sky, because the sky is bright. Do that over here too. Okay. Good. Let's add white to that now. A little bit of water. And start stippling that on. I'm noticing a lot over here. And I want to kind of group those together. Drop them down. Lots of tree bows here. And we didn't have that extra layer because this tree really has a lot of just this bright pink up against the darkness, and I wanted to kind of create more of that. So more of that texture, some that are leaning this way. And there's a dog barking at me. He is not pleased. And his owner's on a cell phone. So let's see if I get bitten. That would be the coup de grace. Maybe this is the universe telling me, Danny, stop making art. It's too dangerous. Wild beasts. Alright, the guy's off his cell phone now. I'm safe for the time being. As somebody who owns a dog, I will never take a dog for granted. If they get in their mind that you're their enemy, as much as I love Harry, sometimes he decides I'm the enemy, and it's a little bit hard to convince him otherwise. Usually it's because he hasn't gotten the treats that he wants. So I'm kind of doing a combination of dry brushing here. And then I'm going to darken some of this down. I am seeing now. I'm going to add, I want to gray this down. Let's say you don't know what to do. I'm going to use two of my other colors. So a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow to get a darker, more desaturated version, because I am seeing some of these that are in shadow. So a little bit of yellow ochre there, just because it's a dirtier and darker yellow. A little bit of blue, maybe a little bit more blue, not that much. And I want to create some of these blooms in shadow. And you can see that next to those. Let's darken it down even more. So more blue, maybe a little bit of yellow. I don't want to desaturate it too much, so let's put some of that red back in. There we go. And this is just kind of adding, again, more variety. That's kind of the name of the game as far as I'm concerned, is like adding that variety into what you're laying down. And the more variety and the more texture and the more like sense of depth and direction and all of that you can get, the better that it's going to be. Okay. Now let's take some of that. Remember we did alizarin and some white, but I'm going to add a lot of white. And we're going to add even another layer of highlights. Let me switch to even a smaller brush now.
In the next video, we'll bring the painting to a complete finish by adding details, highlights, and textures, as well as correcting our mistakes. Click here to watch the previous video, part 1, and here to watch the next one, part 3. Remember, you have a voice that matters. Go be creative. I'll see you next time.